listening to the Pro Football Focus Chalk Talk podcast. I'm Scott Barrett, joined as always by Tyler Buecher. If you listen to our Thanksgiving slate breakdown, I apologize. If you haven't listened to it, don't listen to it. It was Thanksgiving. Yeah, Tyler, what would you say about Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving, if you didn't play Marvin Jones, you probably weren't in the green. That's what happens on these small slates. You get one guy who goes off for 30-plus points, kind of just changes everything. And Marv was that guy. He and Keenan Allen, they both put up fantastic fantasy outings. If you didn't have either of them, you probably weren't cashing much. That's how Thanksgiving went.
And he did it against Xavier Rhodes, who's historically shut him down every time they faced each other. I said yesterday Marvin Jones' big day was a gift from the fantasy gods so that I could just sit down and enjoy Thanksgiving with my family rather than sweat DFS all day. But we're on to Week 12, and I feel really good about the Sunday slate. Tyler, let's just jump right into things and start off with quarterbacks. Who immediately stands out to you?
Man, well, this slate as a whole, this is going to be a fun Week 12 weekend slate. Like, if anyone who struggled on Thanksgiving is looking to maybe dial it back a little bit, I wouldn't at all. This looks like a great one to load up on. Tons of great plays at every position. Starting at the quarterback, there's a couple guys at the top that I really like. I'm not afraid to pay up this week. Russell Wilson, $7K on DraftKings. He's great for cash, great for tournaments. He had a slow start to the season, but Russell Wilson has scored at least 25 fantasy points in 6 of his last 8 games. Now has a really great matchup here against a struggling 49ers secondary. The 49ers have allowed multiple touchdowns in 5 straight games to opposing quarterbacks, 13 total over that time span, with opposing quarterbacks posting the 6th highest passer rating against them. The Seahawks run game is nearly non-existent now, and I'm thinking like this whole offense is going to run entirely through Russ. What do you think about Russ here?
I'm with you. I think he's probably my top quarterback on this slate. Really, like you said, he's just been a complete monster this season. He's averaging 26.6 fantasy points per game since Week 3. That's 4.3 more than the next closest defense. San Francisco ranks 4th worst in fantasy points allowed per dropback, 4th worst against expectation over their last 5 games. Also, San Francisco's super vulnerable on the ground, but Seattle hasn't had a running game all year. Eddie Lacy and Thomas Rawls ranked worst and 2nd worst of 60 qualifying running backs in yards per carry average. Mike Davis is going to be out for Week 12. That leaves them with really those 2 running backs who I feel aren't really deserving of usage, and J.D. McKissick, who was a wide receiver all 4 years of college. So I'm hoping Seattle sort of uses him as an extension of the running game with some quick, easy dump-offs, cheat code, fantasy points for Russell Wilson. And I'm not really worried about if this game is a blowout, as some people have talked about. Russ scored 29 points in each of the team's only 2 two-score victories. I love Jimmy Graham. I love Doug Baldwin. I like McKissick on DraftKings. Looking at those guys, but at the same time, man, Tom Brady, it just seems so hard to avoid. Miami's defense ranks 2nd worst in opposing passer rating. He just dropped 25.6 on the defense that ranked last in opposing passer rating, the Raiders. Miami also ranks worst in fantasy points per game over expectation allowed to opposing quarterbacks over their last 5 games. And come on, it's Tom Brady.
Yeah, multiple touchdowns, 300-yard mark. The guy's got both those almost on lock here against Miami. I think he's a great play as well. The New England Patriots are implied for a slate-leading 32.25 points currently. I wouldn't be shocked if all these fantasy points came via Brady. I really, really like Brandon Cooks to pair him with this week. I think Cooks is in a smash spot here. But sticking with quarterbacks, another guy that I'm interested in at a little bit lower of a salary tag is Marcus Mariota. The Titans are a team that I'm really looking to target here this week. I think they have a chance to just completely blow out the Colts at home in Indianapolis. Indy has allowed the 2nd most passing yards, and their pass rush ranks 2nd worst on converting pressures into sacks. That means Mariota should have plenty of time to throw deep, go through his progressions, while still having the ability to take off and run against their lackadaisical pass rush. Mariota's passing rushing upside is back. We saw him run a touchdown in on the ground last week, and the week before that he ran for 50-plus yards. I really like Mariota for tournaments this week. Any other quarterbacks that draw your attention?
Yeah, there are a few. I like Andy Dalton quite a bit. The Browns are the league's most glaring pass funnel defense, ranking second best in yards per carry, third worst in opposing passer rating. The Bengals are also something of a pass funnel offense, or at least they should be. They rank second worst in yards per carry. Cleveland ranks third worst in fantasy points allowed per dropback, third worst over expectation. In his last 5 games against Cleveland, he averages 22.7 fantasy points per game and an absurd 136.2 passer rating. He's a better play on FanDuel than he is DraftKings, but it's a strong play this week. I would not stack him with AJ Green, though. Instead, I'd lean towards Tyler Kroft, but we can talk about that maybe in the other positions. Paxton Lynch, as gross as it sounds, is another guy I'm sort of interested in. He's going to draw near zero ownership at a near minimum price tag, and the Raiders have been a historically bad pass defense. Their opposing passer rating, which ranks last in the league, 113.2, if owned by a single quarterback, would tie Tony Romo's 2014 season for the 6th best all time.
Yeah, near minimum, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns. Lynch just smashes value if you were to get those benchmarks there. That kind of wraps it up for the quarterbacks I'm on this week. Anyone else before we move on to the next position?
There are a few guys. Tyrod Taylor, I could see drawing low ownership. He's in an exploitable matchup, and Kansas City runs man coverage at the highest rate in the league, something we look for when targeting these mobile quarterbacks. It's still early yet, but Jared Goff could face New Orleans without their 3 starting cornerbacks. That could push him into contention even without Robert Woods. Though I think that wraps it up for me, and we can move on to running backs. And what stands out to me is there are like 5 running backs I love at the high price range, and then no one else there, and then a ton of running backs to like who are cheaper. Let's start off with you, Tyler. Who immediately stands out?
The guy that I want 100% exposure to in cash games is Todd Gurley. He's the highest priced running back on the main slate of DraftKings this week. Currently playing at home as a 2.5 point favorite against the New Orleans Saints. New Orleans is allowing the 3rd highest yards per carry on the year at 4.7 yards and have allowed 4 100-yard rushing backs to date. Also a 100-yard receiving back, Christian McCaffrey. Gurley's that do-it-all back, getting a ton of receiving and rushing work. I think he can put up a ton of fantasy points here. He's averaging 22.5 touches per game. I think he arguably has one of the highest floors and possibly ceilings among all running backs this week. I think he's great for cash and great for tournaments. All right, I'm going to let you talk about your friend here, your BFF, Kareem Hunt. Sell me on him this week against the Bills and what looks like one of the best matchups on the slate.
You're absolutely right. So, contrary to public opinion, there's been little drop-off in efficiency for Hunt. He ranks 2nd in PFF elusive rating across weeks 1 through 5. But now he ranks 1st across weeks 6 through 11. The offensive line has underperformed as of late, but they're all and they were dealing with injuries, but all are back and practicing in full for week 12. Volume is the concern, but game script works towards his favor. They're favored by 10 points against the Bills, and like you said, the matchup is fantastic. The Bills are allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game, the 2nd most over expectation to running backs this year. But since trading away Marcel Darius in week 8, they're allowing a league worst 42.7 fantasy points per game. That's 7.3 more than the next closest defense. They went from ranking 5th best to 2nd worst in yards per carry, 7th best to worst in rushing yards per game, as well as allowing 10 rushing touchdowns over the stretch, which is 5 more than the next closest defense. At the same time, though, Todd Gurley, lot to like. Le'Veon Bell is on pace for the 6th most touches by any player any season all time. He should get heavy usage again this week, favored by 14 points. And then what do you do with the New Orleans running backs? Since trading away Adrian Peterson, Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara rank 1st and 2nd best respectively in fantasy points per game. and he draw a run funnel defense in the Rams, who rank third worst in fantasy points per game. So I'm on all these guys. It's really hard for me to just single out any one player. Anyone else in that range you're looking at?
No, I agree with you on the Saints running backs. Ingram, since Adrian Peterson's departure, Ingram is averaging 24.7 DraftKings points. Kamara's right there with him at 21.6. The difference is there's only a $400 difference here when we're looking on DraftKings as far as salary goes. We're not seeing the major discount we were earlier in the year with Kamara. These top priced running backs this week, man, they're in some really, really good spots. And I think we're going to see a lot of heavy ownership up there. In tournaments, it could be a bit more beneficial to pay down at the position or possibly look at one of the high-priced running backs that nobody will be on, and that's LaShawn McCoy. Getting Tyrod back in this offense really elevates this entire Buffalo Bills squad. No Nathan Peterman, thank goodness. And it's a pretty quality matchup here. Despite the Bills being on the road, the Chiefs are allowing the 7th most rushing yards, 3rd most rushing touchdowns. I think he's a really great GPP play if you're looking for one of those high-priced running backs that could go off that's a little bit lower owned than the other guys. But you nailed it on the head, though, to begin this segment. High-priced running backs are in great spots this week. You're going to have to differentiate in other ways. As such, what do you think about the lower-priced running backs? Which guys are you looking at here?
I just want to add, I think one concern with LaShawn McCoy is that Mike Tolberg's going to be out, which might actually hurt his floor. Travaris Cadet saw 6 targets, had 3 carries last week. I don't have him in that same tier as the other guys, but I definitely can see why you'd like him. As far as values go, I like Tevin Coleman quite a bit on FanDuel, where he's only the 20th highest priced running back. So since he entered the league, he ranks 7th best in yards per carry, 2nd best in yards per target average. He had a brutal matchup last week against the Seahawks, who ranked best in yards per carry allowed since week 4. Coleman has seen 40 carries and 3 targets the last 2 weeks with Freeman out, and Freeman will not be playing this week. The matchup's neutral, but Coleman has scored in back-to-back weeks, and Atlanta has the 2nd highest implied total of the week. I like Jamal Williams for similar reasons. If Ty Montgomery is again out, he saw 18 carries, 6 targets, and ran the 3rd most routes at the position last week, though his matchup is a little bit tougher than Coleman's. I have a few other guys, but who else are you looking at, Tyler?
Man, it's a pretty deep position this week. For a contrarian kind of play, I really like DeMarco Murray here. He's kind of been piquing my interest as the week has gone on. The Colts are pretty susceptible to opposing running backs via the ground and the air, and Murray has shown he's pretty adept at both. The last time these two teams played each other, Tennessee ran for 171 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. However, most of that fell on the shoulders of Derrick Henry. I'm expecting a lot of that more to fall on Murray this time around. Since their Week 8 bye, Murray has seen over 75% of the team's offensive snaps. Derrick Henry has seen just 30. So the team's definitely leaning towards Murray now as we're getting into the later part of the season. I guess they want to try to milk as much of his contract out of them as they can. The Titans are currently implied for 24.25 points. Really like the odds of Murray hitting the end zone this week with the Titans running the 3rd highest run play percentage inside the red zone. Another cheap guy I'm really into is Duke Johnson. Cincinnati has allowed the 3rd most receptions to opposing running backs. Cleveland has come out and said that they want to give him the ball more this week. I think he makes a lot of sense as a salary saver. I really like this matchup here with him against the Bengals, who have really struggled defending the ball, and Cleveland should be in some negative game script here. What other bargain bin guys are you looking at?
We touched on J.D. McKissick a little bit, but I like him a lot. For some of the reasons outlined earlier, as well as San Francisco is allowing the most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But Devontae Booker is the same price on DraftKings. He saw a season-high workload in snap share, carries, targets, expected fantasy points. He could see even more work this week after C.J. Anderson basically cost them a game with a 4th quarter fumble. Booker has also led Denver's running backs in targets in 5 of the last 6 games. Oakland ranks 19th best in rushing fantasy points per game, but is allowing the second most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I think there's also a strong case to be made for Jay Ajayi. He's definitely deserving of a larger workload. He's totaled 166 rushing yards and just 15 carries. That's an 11.7 yards per carry average in his first 2 games with the team. Also, Zach Ertz seems less than 100% healthy. Had his first really poor performance last week. And Alshon Jeffrey's quietly in a tough matchup with the Bears, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers running routes from his side of the field. So if you think Philadelphia is going to hit their total, it's the 3rd highest total of the slate, maybe it's Jay Ajayi. Maybe he has that breakout game we've all been looking for, but admittedly it's tough to sort of bank on that.
Yeah, it's tough with the committee there. So many different running backs it could go to. It's been very tilting seeing Corey Clement come in and steal those red zone carries and get those red zone touchdowns. Any other running backs you want to touch on?
No, that's it for me.
All right, wide receiver. All right, we got to start with the obvious play. It's Julio Jones week, guys. Julio Jones is going to go absolutely nuclear this week. I've got my jersey ready. I'm going to be wearing it all day Sunday. I'm just super pumped for him this week. He's got a dream matchup here against the Buccaneers. Over his past 6 games against Tampa Bay, Jones has averaged 11.8 targets, 8.2 receptions, nearly 120 receiving yards, and 0.8 touchdowns per game. The Buccaneers on the season, they've allowed the most receptions, the most receiving yards, and the 5th most receiving touchdowns. They've allowed 3 wide receivers to go absolutely bananas against them, scoring over 30 DraftKings points. Julio runs over 40% of his routes from the left wide receiver position. That means he'll draw a massive advantage here against cornerback Robert McClain. McClain is our number 112 graded cornerback out of 118 qualifying. He's allowing a 78.6 completion percentage when targeted. I think this could be the week where Julio breaks the slate, drops a 40 burger on us, and just completely changes how we view the Week 12 slate entirely.
We know Julio Jones has that slate-busting upside any week he's on the field. And I'm with you. I can see it being this week. Across his 6 games over the last 3 seasons against Tampa Bay, he's averaging 27.1 fantasy points per game. He's due for some serious touchdown regression, ranking 7th in the league in end zone targets, yet scoring only 1 touchdown. Mohamed Sanu's actually in an equally good matchup. Tampa Bay is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers, though that's more of a reason to play Matt Ryan than it is to play Sanu over Julio Jones. But I'm with you. He was the first high-priced wide receiver to stand out. Obviously, Antonio Brown is in a smash spot as well. He's not going to be on the main slate on DraftKings, but against that porous Green Bay secondary, I could see him having a completely monster game. I like Doug Baldwin quite a bit. He has a dream matchup against Quan Williams in the slot. Williams, it ranks bottom 10 among 118 qualifying cornerbacks in both PFF grade and fantasy points allowed per route and coverage. Who are some other higher priced wide receivers you might be looking at?
Great calls. Love the Antonio Brown and Doug Baldwin plays. Brandon Cooks is another guy that I want to jam in. He's coming off a massive week, and I think he's going to repeat it here. He's in a prime spot against the Dolphins. Without Chris Hogan in the lineup over the last 2 weeks, Cooks has amassed 20 targets over those 2 games, scoring 13.4 and 29.9 DraftKings points. The Dolphins struggled defending the pass at every level of the field. I think Cooks could be in line for another massive performance this week. Jarvis Landry is another guy that kind of draws my attention, 6,800. I think both he and Kenny Stills are great plays for different reasons. Landry, he draws the largest advantage per our wide receiver cornerback matchup chart, and that's against slot cornerback Eric Rowe for New England. Rowe hasn't played enough snaps to qualify in our grading system, but had he met the minimum threshold, his 34.1 grade would rank 2nd worst among all cornerbacks. His 2.54 yards per route covered ranks 2nd worst among all corners. And I think Landry is in a great position here to just eat up a ton of yards after the catch in this matchup. Should draw a ton of garbage time work. Really like the matchup here as well for Kenny Stills. You've done some great work here, noting his hookup connection here with Matt Moore. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so absurdly, over the last 2 seasons, in the 7 games Matt Moore has made an appearance, he's averaging 18.5 fantasy points per game. In all other 19 games over this stretch, he's averaging just 8.8 fantasy points per game. For perspective, 18.5 would be tied with Odell Beckham Jr. for the third most fantasy points per game among all wide receivers this season. It doesn't even tell us the whole story, though. Over the past 2 seasons, among all 208 receivers to run at least 200 routes with a specific quarterback, the Matt Moore to Kenny Stills connection ranks 8th best in yards per route run, 4th best in fantasy points per route run, 1st best in fantasy points per target. That's above connections like Tom Brady to Rob Gronkowski, A.J. Green, and Andy Dalton. So at his, just wide receiver 44 price tag on DraftKings, wide receiver 49 price tag on FanDuel, he's clearly one of the top value plays to me on this slate. Cooper Kupp also immediately jumped out to me on both sites. Robert Woods is out. But what's really important to me here is the status of New Orleans cornerbacks. So Kenny Vaccaro is their safety, but he covers the slot. He's questionable, but he missed last week's game. If he misses, that sets Cooper Kupp up for a really nice game. And then Ken Crowley and Marshawn Lattimore, the starting cornerbacks on the outside, are both questionable and looking actually more doubtful than Vaccaro is. And if Lattimore was out, that would boost up Sammy Watkins considerably. And even more so if Crawley was also out, because there's kind of this uncertainty here. This is something to monitor heading into Sunday's games. But like both of those guys quite a bit. I can make a compelling case for Corey Davis, but I know that's your guy right now. So why don't you talk him up?
Okay, we'll do. I just want to say I love that Kupp call. He's a guy that's really drawn my interest here, especially in cash games at just 5K. Corey Davis at 4.9K. I think he's right there as well for cash. We just saw news earlier today on Friday that Rashard Matthews was a DNP for practice. If he's out, Corey Davis could see a massive bump in targets. Davis is currently running 87% of his routes on the outside for Tennessee, 53% lining up on the left. That means he'll run the majority of his routes against Pierre Desir and against Indianapolis's stationary cornerback scheme. 92 cornerbacks have played more snaps in coverage than Desir, and yet Desir ranks tied for 18th for the most touchdowns allowed in coverage. He's currently our number 101 graded cornerback out of the 118 and has really struggled so far. Davis has seen 22 targets since coming back after their Week 8 bye. He's neck and neck with Rashard Matthews for snaps. Like, they're both seeing almost near equivalent volume and opportunities. If Rashard's out, I think we see a massive uptick here for Davis, and he could be in for a really big game here, maybe 100 yards, touchdown. Just a guy that has a chance to just go off.
I'm absolutely with you. A slightly less strong play, but for similar reasons, is Zay Jones. He's actually seen a slightly better expected fantasy point volume than Corey Davis. He also has a few receivers banged up, and Kelvin Benjamin likely out. Jordan Matthews questionable. He runs 49% of his routes from the left. That's where Kansas City is allowing the most fantasy points per game, 20% from the slot. Kansas City is allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game there. They're also allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game on deep passes, where Tyrod Taylor has been targeting Zay Jones heavily as of late. Another similar guy to me is Corey Coleman. He has a 34% target market share across 3 full games. That would rank 2nd most among all receivers, despite those 3 games coming against teams ranking top 10 in fewest targets per game, fewest fantasy points per game. He has, on paper, another tough matchup against Cincinnati, who ranks highly in all of these metrics, but these should be without Darqueze Dennard, who's our number 32 graded cornerback and typically mans Coleman's side of the field. So I like him quite a bit. Also, on a small sample size, Paxton Lynch has shown a clear preference to Emmanuel Sanders, who is quite cheap on DraftKings. I don't know if he's 100% healthy, but he's also been used as the team's top deep threat for 2 seasons. And Oakland is the defense you want to target with deep receivers. They're allowing the third most fantasy points per game to receivers on deep targets. I like Devontae Adams. Juju Smith-Schuster is out. So maybe there's a case to be made for Martavis Bryant, but I don't want to be the one to make it. But on the other side of the ball, I do like Adams quite a bit. He's actually seen a significant uptick in volume following Aaron Rodgers' departure. He's increased in targets per game, increased in expected fantasy points per game, while the exact and complete and total opposite of that has happened for Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb. He's cemented himself as this team's wide receiver one. The Steelers are a tough matchup on paper, but I don't know if they're a tough matchup this week. Joe Hayden, their highest graded cornerback, should be out. He played 10 snaps in Week 10, missed all of Week 11. Over that span, Chester Rogers and Rashard Matthews both totaled over 100 yards and a score. Those are the two highest scoring games they've allowed all season. What else you got from me, Tyler?
One guy we kind of glossed over a bit was T.Y. Hilton. I think he's in a really great spot here against the Titans. Over the last 2 weeks, Antonio Brown just went off against them. A.J. Green went off the week before that. If the Titans are going to run all over the Colts in this game as I'm anticipating, I think it makes sense to bring it back with a little bit of Hilton. He's got a really nice matchup here against Adoree Jackson, who's allowed over 400 yards in coverage and 4 touchdowns with 0 interceptions. I think he's a great play there, Hilton. Another bargain bin guy that I'm super into this week, though, is D.D. Westbrook. I can't not mention his name. Marquise Lee should be shadowed by Patrick Peterson for much of this game. Allen Hurns has already been ruled out for this weekend. It sets up D.D. Westbrook for both volume and a really good matchup here against the 45-year-old Tramon Williams. The dude's just ancient. I'm surprised they're still employing him back there. I think this is a great setup this week for D.D. to smash, and this is the week. We've been waiting for it. This is the week.
I would love that for sure. Do you want to move on to tight ends?
Yeah, let's get to it. So this is a week where we're going to see a lot of people pay up at running back, and I think we're going to see a lot of people pay up at the tight end position as well. I think Gronk, Kelsey, Ertz, I think they could all draw some significant ownership. So I think it might be a little prudent to maybe pivot off of that, take advantage of everyone's current spending habits and pay down at the position. Tyler Kroft, like you mentioned in your Andy Dalton segment, I think he's in a great spot here. He's just 3,900 on DraftKings, allows some pretty good wiggle room to fit in some stud running backs as well. Kroft has scored at least 9 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 outings. The Browns are a team that we typically target with opposing tight ends. I don't think Kroft is any exception here. In fact, his biggest game of the year came when these two teams squared off in Week 4. Kroft put up 6 receptions for 68 yards and 2 touchdowns, 24.8 fantasy points. I could see a lot of people paying up at tight end, which is why I think it would be a bit of a contrarian move to go elsewhere and pay down at the position.
I'm with you on Kroft for sure. In Cincinnati's last 2 games against Cleveland, tight ends have combined for 4 touchdown catches against them, including 2 for Kroft. The last time he played, he also surprisingly ranked 7th among tight ends in fantasy points per game since Week 4, and Cleveland's allowed the most fantasy points per game to tight ends over the past 2 seasons. I like Jared Cook quite a bit. He is the 34th highest priced tight end of the week on FanDuel, which is absurd considering he ranks top 10 in expected and actual fantasy points per game this year. Denver's also something of a tight end funnel defense. They rank 3rd best in fantasy points per game over expectation of opposing wide receivers, 5th best to running backs, but 3rd worst to tight ends. In each of the past 2 seasons, they've led the league in percentage of receiving fantasy points allowed, specifically going to tight ends. And Cooper and Crabtree have failed to reach 60 receiving yards and have combined for just 1 touchdown in the 5 games against the Broncos over the past 3 seasons. Cook saw team highs in targets, air yards, end zone targets, deep targets, and near season highs in all of those categories the last time these 2 teams faced each other. I also like Greg Olsen quite a bit in his first game back with Calvin Benjamin in Buffalo, Curtis Samuel on IR, Devin Funchess drawing Maurice Claiborne. Olsen's just been a fantasy stud for the past 5-6 years or so, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's heavily used this week, even though it's his first game back.
Yeah, that's one part of information I'm going to try to pay attention to on Sunday is what beat reporters are saying as far as snaps and how many routes we could see Greg Olsen run. Like you mentioned, he's just been a stud. He saw 7 or more targets in 13 of 15 games played last year. Dude should be locked in for volume here against the Jets. I like the Jared Cook call a lot. He burned a lot of people last week. I think recency bias could play a factor. 34th price tight end. Like, that's way too cheap for a guy of Cook's caliber who's seeing the kind of volume he is. When I want to pay up top, though, I think I'm going to look at Rob Gronkowski. He's priced at 6,900. Like, do I need to say any more?
Nice.
He draws a terrific matchup here against the Dolphins. They fared terribly against opposing tight ends this year. They're allowing the 2nd most receptions, 7th most receiving yards, 4th most receiving touchdowns. It's just a smash play here for Gronk, and I'm expecting him to just go off. He has a 26% target market share of New England's air yards, 20% market share of the team's total targets. The Patriots here are highest scoring game of the week. It's what we want to target here in DFS. Tight ends playing with a very high team total. I don't think there's much more to say on Gronk. I'm going to have a little bit of trouble, though, differentiating how many shares I want to split between Gronk and Kelsey. I think Kelsey's also in a really great spot here against the Bills. I think he's drawn 7 or more targets in 6 of his last 7 games. He just erupted last week against the Giants, despite not getting in the end zone. Kelsey's like impervious to any kind of poor fantasy outing. I think they're both really, really, really strong plays this week.
I'm with you, but let's also not forget about Jimmy Graham. So I think people are going to look at this matchup and think it's tough just because San Francisco has impressive season-long numbers against tight ends this year. But since they've lost safety Jaquiski Tartt, who primarily covered the tight end, ranked top 10 in PFF coverage grade, they've surrendered a touchdown to a tight end in 3 straight weeks. Graham, meanwhile, ranks 2nd among tight ends and 17th among all receivers in expected fantasy points per game. He's actually tied neck and neck with Doug Baldwin. He ranks 1st among all players in targets inside the 5, 10, and 20-yard lines, and 2nd in end zone targets. He's a really strong bet to score a touchdown. We talked about Rashard Matthews being out, what that means for Tennessee's passing attack. He has a 20% target market share. Now, hopefully, in what's always been more of a run-first offense that spreads the ball around, hopefully these targets will be more concentrated, and Delaney Walker easily leads the team in expected fantasy points per game, could be in line for a bigger day. And I like Jack Doyle quite a bit as well, but I know you do too, so when you convince our listeners why he is in consideration.
I think it's just pricing. I mean, he's hasn't been priced up at all this year, yet he's consistently been playing well. Over their last 6 games, Doyle has averaged 9.5 targets per game while scoring in half those contests. I mean, you can't beat that bang for your buck. The Titans are currently 3-point road favorites against them this week. Garbage time fantasy points are still fantasy points. Doyle's consistent volume, it's unparalleled at that price point. And I just think he makes a very strong cash game play that doesn't really break the bank. That about wraps it up for tight ends, though, for me. Is there anyone else you're looking at?
No, that's about it for me as well. What do you say we go into defenses?
If we must. All right. I'm going to be a homer. I'm going to say the Eagles against the Bears are in a tremendous spot. I'm surprised they're priced so low on both sites. I think they make for a very strong play here against Mitch Trubisky. Their run defense has been incredible. I won't be surprised at all if they shut down Jordan Howard, forced the Bears to become one-dimensional in the second half, and we can see this pass rush really make days hectic for opposing quarterbacks. The Eagles are probably one of my top plays now that we've dove into the slate a bit more.
I think the Jaguars are worth paying up for against Blaine Gabbert, as are the Bengals against Cleveland and the Steelers against the Packers. These are all defenses pressuring the quarterback at an extremely high rate up against inexperienced quarterbacks who struggle with pressure. Also, Baltimore Ravens defense has been fantastic, and anytime you can play a defense against Tom Savage, you have to do it. I think that's about it for everyone I'm looking at. Anyone else, Tyler?
I'll just add the Falcons. They've been on a tear lately. 11 sacks, 4 turnovers, and a touchdown over the last couple weeks. They're 10-point home favorites against Ryan Fitzpatrick. I kind of like them there. 2,900. That's like like these bottom barrel or median priced defenses, they've been really shaking up the slates lately. So if you can narrow in on like the right one to play, you could vault yourself to the top of a GPP leaderboard very quickly.
Tyler, I think we crushed it this week. We agreed on a ton of calls. So I'm hoping for a nice rebound day on Sunday. Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. Please subscribe on iTunes. Please leave us a 5-star review. It would mean a lot. We keep bringing these to you every week, ad-free. So just thank you for listening. And yeah, we'll see you guys all next week.